John Densmore arrived at the rehearsal space on Santa Monica Boulevard before anyone else. This was not unusual. He had always been the first to arrive, the drummer's habit, the need to settle into the room before the music began, to sit behind the kit and feel the space before it filled with sound. But that morning in November 1970, the earliness felt different. He sat on his stool in the empty room and looked at the microphone stand in the center of the floor and thought about something he could not yet name. The stand was there, Jim Morrison was not, and the distance between those two facts, the stand waiting, Jim absent, felt in the particular silence of that morning like a question that the room itself was asking. The doors had been asked to leave Sunset Sound. Not asked exactly, the situation was more complicated and more human than that, as most situations involving Jim Morrison had become by late 1970. The studio had concerns. There were questions about reliability, about the atmosphere certain sessions had generated, about whether the machinery of professional recording could continue to function around a frontman who was moving, visibly and with increasing speed, in a direction that had very little to do with the requirements of a major label record. The band had responded by moving the sessions to their own rehearsal space, a converted office building on Santa Monica Boulevard that they had been using for practice, and that now, by necessity, became a recording studio. They brought in Bruce Botnick to engineer. They set up microphones in a room that had not been designed for recording and discovered in the process that the imperfection of the space produced something the professional studio had not, a sound that was alive in the way that rooms are alive when they have not been acoustically managed into submission. Jim Morrison arrived that first morning at the Santa Monica space carrying a notebook. John Densmore noticed this immediately, because Jim always carried notebooks, but the way he was carrying this one was different, held loosely, almost casually, as if it contained something he had already finished with rather than something he was still working toward. He set it on a chair near the microphone, not on the floor, not in his bag, on a chair, within reach. And then he looked around the room, at Robbie Krieger tuning his guitar in the corner, at Ray Manzarek settling at the keyboards, at the microphone stand in the center, at Bruce Botnick behind the glass of the improvised control area, and something in his expression was different from anything John had seen in the previous 4 years of watching Jim Morrison's face. It was not peace exactly. John would spend a long time in the years after trying to find the right word for what Jim's face held in those early sessions at Santa Monica Boulevard. It was something closer to arrival. As if Jim Morrison had been in transit for a very long time and had finally, in this imperfect room with its imperfect acoustics and its folding chairs and its complete absence of the professional apparatus of fame, arrived somewhere that was worth arriving at. But to understand what John Densmore witnessed in that room, you have to understand what he had been watching for the 4 years before it. John had been there from the beginning, from the earliest rehearsals in Ray Manzarek's apartment, from the London Fog residency on Sunset Strip where they played 4 sets a night to rooms that held 20 people, from the recording of the first album, which had been made with the particular intensity of people who do not yet know they are about to become famous and are therefore free to make exactly what they want to make. He had watched Jim Morrison become one of the most discussed figures in American music from a position that very few people occupied, close enough to see the person underneath the performer, far enough behind the drums to observe without being consumed. What John saw from behind those drums was not always what the audiences saw from the floor. The audiences saw the Lizard King, the leather-clad, dark-haired, dangerously present frontman who moved across stages as if the normal rules of physical space did not apply to him, who delivered lyrics that felt less like songs and more like transmissions from somewhere the rest of the band could not quite follow. What John saw was the preparation for that, and the aftermath of it, and the growing distance between the two. He saw Jim arrive at venues 2 hours early and sit alone backstage with the notebook. He saw Jim stand in the wings before shows with his eyes closed for long enough that the crew would sometimes approach to make sure he was all right. He saw what Jim's face looked like when the show was over and the crowd noise had faded and there was nothing left to perform for, a particular exhaustion that was not physical, not the tiredness of a body that has worked hard, but the tiredness of a person who has been required for 2 hours to be more than they are, and is now in the process of finding their way back to ordinary scale. By 1969, the distance between Jim Morrison, the performer, and Jim Morrison person had become something John felt in the room during recording sessions. Jim would deliver a vocal take of extraordinary power, the kind of take that made everyone in the studio stop what they were doing and simply listen, and then step back from the microphone with an expression that suggested the take had come from somewhere he did not entirely control and could not entirely account for. As if the voice and the words had passed through him from some other source, and he was now waiting, slightly dazed, for them to stop. John had asked him about this once, carefully, in the oblique way that close collaborators develop for questions that cannot be asked directly. Jim had said, "The good ones always feel like they came from somewhere else. The ones that don't feel that way are the ones I don't trust." The Morrison Hotel sessions in early 1970 had been different. From everything before them, rougher, more blues-influenced, stripped of some of the studio sophistication that had characterized the earlier records. Jim had pushed for that direction, had wanted to get back to something more elemental, and the band had followed because they trusted the instinct even when they didn't entirely understand it. But there had been difficult days. Days when Jim arrived at the studio in a state that made recording impossible. Days when the gap between what the sessions needed and what Jim could provide was unbridgeable. John had sat behind the drums on those days and played anyway, because playing was the only thing he knew how to do, with the particular frustration of watching someone he admired be unable to access what he knew they possessed. And then November 1970 arrived, and the Santa Monica Boulevard space, and Jim carrying the notebook like something already finished, and that expression on his face that John would spend years trying to name. The LA Woman sessions lasted through December and into the early weeks of 1971. They were unlike anything the band had previously recorded, not in sound only, though the sound was different, warmer and more immediate and rougher in ways that the professional studio would have smoothed away. They were different in the quality of Jim's presence. He was, by every account from every person in that room, more concentrated than he had been in years. Not more controlled. Concentration and control were not the same thing, and Jim Morrison had always understood the difference. He was more present, more willing to be in the room with whatever the room was generating, to follow the music into the places it wanted to go rather than directing it toward the places the image required it to go. He sang sitting down. This was the detail John would return to most often in later years, the detail that carried for him the most meaning. Jim Morrison had spent 4 years singing standing up, had built a performance style around the vertical body, around the relationship between the upright figure and the microphone, around the physical presence of a person occupying space in a way that demanded attention. In the Santa Monica space, he pulled a stool in front of the microphone and sat, not because he was tired, not because he was unwell, because sitting changed something about the relationship between the voice and the song, made it more intimate, more contained, more like a person speaking to someone nearby rather than transmitting to the back of an arena. John watched this from behind the drums and understood something that he did not say aloud, because saying it aloud would have required a vocabulary he did not yet have. What he understood was that the sitting was a choice about how to use what was left. Jim Morrison knew, in the particular way that people know things they cannot explain and cannot prove, that these sessions were a kind of ending. Not a deliberate ending. Jim was not performing a farewell. He was simply, for the first time in years, making music without the apparatus of the image, without the requirements of the Lizard King persona, without the forward momentum of a career that had organized itself around his most electric qualities and demanded their delivery on schedule. In that imperfect room, he was making music for the reason he had always claimed music should be made, because there was something true to say, and this was the best available way to say it. There was an evening in December 1970 that John Densmore has returned to in interviews more than any other moment from his 4 years with Jim Morrison. They had finished a take of a song that would appear on LA Woman, the title track, which ran to nearly 8 minutes and was, in John's assessment, the finest sustained vocal performance Jim had ever given. The take was done. The room was quiet. Jim sat on the stool with his eyes closed for perhaps 30 seconds, long enough for John to wonder from behind the drums whether something was wrong. Then Jim opened his eyes and looked across the room at John, past the microphone and the cables and the improvised engineering setup, and said something that John heard clearly and would never entirely stop thinking about. He said, "That one's true." and then he got up from the stool, picked up the notebook from the chair, and walked out of the room to get water, and the session continued, and nobody marked the moment as anything in particular, but John marked it. He marked it the way you mark things that you don't yet know the significance of, but that your body understands before your mind does. That one's true. 4 words from a person who had spent 4 years making music of extraordinary power, and who had never, as far as John could recall, used that particular word, not good, not great, not the best, but true, to describe his own work. The word contained everything: the relief of finally saying the thing you meant to say, the recognition that you had found your way back to something essential after a long time of being required to be something else, and underneath both of those things, so quiet that John almost missed it, the awareness that truth of this kind was rare and should be noted. Jim Morrison flew to Paris in March of 1971. L.A. Woman was released in April of that year. He was dead by July. The album that had been made in a converted office building on Santa Monica Boulevard, by a band working without the apparatus of a professional studio and a frontman singing from a stool with a notebook on a chair beside him, became one of the most critically respected records of his career, praised for exactly the qualities that had made it strange to make: the roughness, the intimacy, the sense of a voice that has stopped performing and started simply speaking. John Densmore heard the news of Jim's death while in Los Angeles. He sat with it in the way you sit with news that you have been, without knowing it, preparing to receive. Because the thing about watching someone from behind the drums for 4 years is that you see things the audience doesn't see, and you know things that the image obscures. John had watched Jim Morrison be extraordinary and difficult and generous and unreachable and present and absent and everything in between. He had watched the distance grow between the person and the performer, and had watched, in those final sessions on Santa Monica Boulevard, something that looked like the distance closing. That one's true. John Densmore still hears those words, still feels the particular quality of the silence that followed them in that room in December 1970. A man who had spent 4 years being one of the most famous performers in America, sitting on a stool in an imperfect room, saying the most important thing he knew how to say, that he had, for a moment, found his way back to something real, and that the finding was worth noting, even if no one else in the room quite understood what had been found. What John Densmore understood about Jim Morrison that most people who wrote about him did not is something that can only be understood from behind a drum kit. The drummer's position in any band is singular, not at the front, not at the keyboards or the guitar, but at the back, elevated slightly, facing the rest of the band and the audience simultaneously, seeing both sides of the performance at once. John had spent 4 years in that position, watching Jim Morrison's back from 10 feet away and the audience's faces from across the room, and the view from that position was unlike any other view available. What he saw was the gap. Every night, in every venue, the gap between what Jim Morrison carried into the room and what the room required of him. Jim carried the poems, the notebooks, the relentless interior life of a person who had been pressing language against the hardest questions since adolescence. The room required the Lizard King, the theatrical, electric, boundary-dissolving performance that the audiences had paid to see, and that the industry had packaged and sold and needed to continue selling. Jim gave the room what the room required. He was too serious about the work, too committed to the idea that live performance was a genuine artistic act rather than a product delivery, to give anything less than everything. But everything, delivered night after night after night in service of an image that was not quite his own, had a cost that John watched accumulate over 4 years from his position behind the drums. The move to Santa Monica Boulevard was, in John's understanding, Jim's attempt to eliminate the gap. By removing the professional studio, they removed a set of expectations. By sitting on the stool, Jim removed the physical posture of the Lizard King. By keeping the notebook on the chair beside him, he kept the poet present in the room, the person who had always been prior to the performer, the person who had been standing on a Venice beach pier in 1965 with a notebook before Ray Manzarek had found the right words to bring him into the music. The Santa Monica sessions were, consciously or not, an attempt to reunite those two figures, the poet and the performer, in conditions that were not organized around the commercial requirements of either. Robbie Krieger noticed it too, though he described it differently. In later interviews, Robbie talked about the LA Woman sessions as the first time he had ever felt that Jim was fully in the room, not partially in the room while some significant portion of his attention was directed elsewhere, not performing presence while actually being somewhere inside himself that the music could not reach, but actually completely, unreservedly there. Playing off him felt different in that room, Robbie said, like the guitar and the voice were actually in conversation rather than delivering parallel monologues into the same microphone. Ray Manzarek characteristically understood it in musical terms. What Jim was doing in those sessions, Ray would say later, was singing the way the poems were written, not projecting outward toward an imagined audience, but pressing inward toward the truth of the thing, the way a poet presses toward the line that is not quite reachable but is the only line that matters. The keyboard parts Ray wrote for LA Woman followed Jim's lead. They were less ornate than on earlier records, less designed to fill space, more willing to hold a note or a chord long enough for the space around it to become part of the music. Bruce Botnick, the engineer who captured all of this on tape, has said that the LA Woman sessions were the most technically imperfect recordings he was ever part of and also the most emotionally precise. The room was not designed for recording. The signal chain was not optimal. There were compromises everywhere, practical decisions made under constraint, and what came through in spite of, or perhaps because of, all that constraint was something that the technically perfect recordings from Sunset Sound and other professional studios had not quite managed. The sound of a voice that was not performing but speaking, and the sound of three musicians who were not accompanying a performance but having a conversation.